When a cocky lawyer and a dismissive judge meet Caroline Levitt, they think it will be an easy win. But what happens next is nothing short of a legal masterclass. The courtroom was packed. A mix of reporters, legal interns, and curious onlookers filled the gallery. There were murmurs, a quiet hum beneath the grand ceiling of the courthouse. The air smelled of old books and polished wood, a scent of history and authority. Seated at the defense table, Caroline Levitt flipped through her notes with steady hands, her expression unreadable. This wasn't her first time arguing a case, but it was the first time she was up against Judge Walter Grayson, a man notorious for his impatience and condescending attitude toward young attorneys, especially women. The case itself wasn't particularly sensational, a contract dispute between a mid-sized firm and a former employee who claimed wrongful termination. But the opposing counsel, Richard Callaway, was a veteran litigator, one who thrived on courtroom theatrics. He was the kind of lawyer who smirked before objecting, who played to the jury even in a bench trial, and today he had an audience. Caroline was aware of the odds stacked against her. She wasn't famous, she wasn't connected, and she wasn't the kind of attorney who made headlines. Yet what she was, however, was prepared. As the bailiff called the courtroom to order, Judge Grayson strode in, his robe billowing slightly as he took his seat. He adjusted his glasses, glancing down at the docket. His gaze flickered to Caroline, then to Callaway, before settling on her once more. "Counselor Levitt," he said, the corner of his mouth twitching, "I see you're representing the defense today." A polite nod. "Yes, Your Honor." He let out a slow breath, as if already exasperated. "Well, let's hope this doesn't turn into a law school seminar." A chuckle rippled through the gallery. Even Callaway grinned, not bothering to hide his amusement. Caroline didn't react. She simply straightened her posture and waited. Callaway stood first, launching into a smooth, practiced opening statement about fairness, responsibility, and corporate ethics. His voice was steady, authoritative, the kind that could make even weak arguments sound compelling. He painted his client as a dedicated professional who had been betrayed by a greedy employer. By the time he finished, he glanced at Caroline with an almost pitying expression, as if she were a child about to recite a school presentation. The judge turned to her. "Counselor, your response." Caroline rose, smoothing out her blazer. Unlike Callaway, she didn't take a dramatic pause. She didn't clear her throat or fumble with papers. She simply spoke. "Your Honor, opposing counsel has presented a compelling narrative. Unfortunately, it's not supported by the facts or the law." The shift was immediate. Callaway's smirk tightened. The judge tilted his head slightly, as if only now considering the idea that she might have something substantive to say. But there was still doubt in the air. She could feel it. She was young. She was underestimated. A brief silence settled over the courtroom, a moment of stillness before the inevitable reaction. Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench, as if contemplating whether to humor Caroline or dismiss her outright. "Miss Levitt," he said, folding his hands in front of him, "that was quite the opening remark. I assume you have something more than just confidence to back it up." A murmur rippled through the gallery. A couple of interns smirked at each other. Callaway barely concealed his amusement, shaking his head as if this was all a waste of time. Caroline, however, remained unshaken. "Your Honor," she replied evenly, "I would never presume confidence alone could win a case. I prefer facts." The judge let out a short, condescending chuckle. "Well, that's good to hear. I'd hate for this to turn into a motivational speech." More laughter, this time louder. Caroline ignored it. She reached for a document in front of her, holding it with steady hands. "If I may, Your Honor, let's talk about Colton Vier's Redbridge, a case that directly contradicts opposing counsel's claim that the termination in question was unlawful." Callaway let out a quiet scoff. "That case doesn't apply here," he said dismissively. "The circumstances are entirely different." Caroline turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time since the proceedings began. "That's incorrect. The precedent is directly relevant because the ruling hinged on a key factor: the presence of a contractual clause limiting termination discretion, which in this case also exists." Callaway blinked, caught off guard for the briefest of moments. Judge Grayson's expression remained unchanged, though his fingers tapped idly against the bench. A sign Caroline knew that he was at least considering her point. "Miss Levitt," the judge said, reclining slightly, "I appreciate the effort, but do you really think a single precedent overrides the fundamental principles of at-will employment?" There it was, the setup. He wanted to school her. Caroline didn't flinch. She flipped through her binder, pulling out another document and holding it up. "Not a single precedent, Your Honor. 5, each of them reinforcing the same principle. Employment contracts with clearly defined limitations cannot be dismissed under at-will doctrine. Would you like me to list them?" The courtroom quieted. The judge stopped tapping his fingers. Callaway's smirk was now noticeably strained. Judge Grayson adjusted his glasses and sighed. "Well, Miss Levitt, since you seem so determined to turn this into a law lecture, by all means, educate us." His sarcasm was sharp, meant to belittle Caroline. She took it as an invitation. She opened her folder, knowing that what she was about to say would change everything. Caroline didn't hesitate. She lifted the first document, her voice steady and deliberate. "Preston v. Briarwood Technologies, 2014. The court ruled that despite an at-will clause, explicit contractual provisions on termination procedures took precedence. That case was presided over by Judge Holden, who, as you may recall, Your Honor, cited your own opinion in a similar ruling the following year." Judge Grayson stopped tapping his fingers. His expression remained neutral, but Caroline caught the slight narrowing of his eyes. A flicker of awareness that she wasn't just quoting any case. She was quoting a case that directly referenced his own judicial philosophy. A few heads in the gallery turned. The mood in the courtroom was shifting. Callaway cleared his throat. "That's still not comparable. That case involved a severance agreement that wasn't honored, which is entirely different from what we're dealing with here." Caroline didn't look at him. She simply reached for the next file. "Wells v. Dartmouth Holdings, 2017. No severance agreement, just a termination clause requiring reasonable cause. The employer argued at will discretion, but the court ruled the contractual obligations supersede at-will doctrine. That case was cited in Burton v. Vance Corporation, 2019, where the decision reinforced that at will is not an absolute shield when clear contractual obligations exist." A hush settled over the room. Judge Grayson leaned forward slightly, his elbow resting on the bench now. He wasn't laughing anymore. Callaway shifted in his seat. He had prepared for a routine argument, one where he could recite the usual legal rhetoric, get a few nods from the judge, and win without much resistance. But Caroline wasn't playing along. The judge exhaled, running a hand over his chin. "All right, Miss Levitt, that's an impressive list of citations. But let's be honest here. Case law can be interpreted in multiple ways. Are you really suggesting that all of these cases eliminate the right of an employer to terminate an employee under at-will doctrine?" This was the moment, the test. He was engaging now, probing her argument instead of dismissing it outright. Caroline held her ground. "No, Your Honor, I'm not arguing that at-will employment is void. I'm arguing that at-will does not override contractual specificity. If a contract explicitly limits termination conditions, then at-will doctrine doesn't apply unless the language allows for it. And in this case, the contract states termination must be based on substantiated cause with supporting documentation." She turned toward Callaway now, looking at him for the first time in full. "Do you have that documentation?" The silence was deafening. Callaway's mouth opened, then closed. He shifted his papers, but Caroline knew the answer before he even spoke. He didn't have it because it didn't exist. Judge Grayson studied her for a long moment. The patronizing tone was gone. The courtroom's energy had shifted entirely, and for the first time, it was clear Caroline wasn't just holding her own. She was winning. A palpable silence stretched across the courtroom. Caroline had done something neither the judge nor Callaway had expected. She had cornered the opposition without theatrics, without overstatement, just pure, precise legal argument. Callaway adjusted his tie, scanning his notes as if the answer would suddenly appear. It wouldn't. Caroline had checked. She had gone through every document in the case file before stepping into court, and she knew for a fact that the necessary substantiated cause, the very condition required for termination, wasn't documented anywhere. Judge Grayson exhaled, rubbing his temple. "Mr. Callaway," he said finally, his voice measured, "Counselor Levitt has presented a strong argument. Do you have documented evidence to prove the termination met the contractual standard?" Callaway hesitated, his mouth pressing into a thin line. He wasn't used to being put on the defensive. "Your Honor," he began, his tone still carrying remnants of the confidence he had walked in with. "At-will employment is the foundation of employer rights. It exists precisely to prevent disputes like this from clogging the courts." Caroline didn't even wait for the judge to respond. She turned slightly toward the gallery, addressing the room as much as the bench. "That's an oversimplification," she countered. "At-will employment is a default rule, not an absolute one. The moment an employer adds specific limitations to a contract, they've voluntarily given up blanket at-will discretion. They can't use it when it's convenient and ignore it when it isn't." The judge leaned forward. "So you're saying the company essentially wrote itself into a box?" Caroline nodded. "Precisely. They wrote the rules and now they're trying to pretend those rules don't apply." The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. A few interns exchanged glances. Even the court reporter, who had remained expressionless through years of routine cases, looked mildly intrigued. Callaway's frustration was becoming visible now. Even if there was no documented reason, the company still had the right to terminate. Caroline turned fully toward him. "If that were true, why include a clause requiring substantiated cause with supporting documentation? Why go through the effort of drafting a condition they never intended to follow?" The weight of her words settled over the room. Callaway had no real answer. Judge Grayson, who had spent the first half of the hearing treating Caroline like an amateur, now regarded her with something very different: genuine consideration. He tapped his pen against the desk, his expression unreadable. "That's a compelling argument, Miss Levitt. I take it you have a proposed course of action?" Caroline nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Given that the termination did not meet the contractual requirements, my client is entitled to either reinstatement or financial compensation for breach of contract." Callaway's jaw tightened. The case had just slipped out of his control, and he knew it. And for the first time since stepping into the courtroom, Caroline knew it too. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, studying Caroline as if seeing her for the first time. The smirk he had worn earlier was gone, replaced by something far more interesting: consideration. The courtroom, once filled with quiet chuckles at her expense, had gone completely still. Callaway, visibly flustered, rifled through his papers, searching for anything that could salvage his argument. He wouldn't find it. The lack of documentation was an undeniable fact, and Caroline had just forced the judge to acknowledge it. Grayson finally let out a slow breath. "Miss Levitt," he said, his voice carrying a tone far removed from the condescension he had started with, "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting such a thorough interpretation of the case law." Caroline remained poised. "I only deal in thorough, Your Honor." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery, this time at Callaway's expense. The judge ignored the reaction and turned back to Callaway. "Mr. Callaway, your client included a termination clause requiring documented cause. The defense has presented multiple precedents supporting their claim. Do you have any evidence to contradict that?" Callaway hesitated, just a beat too long. He knew he was cornered, but he wasn't about to admit defeat so easily. He straightened his tie, shifting tactics. "Your Honor, I believe we're getting lost in legal technicalities. At its core, this case is about employer discretion. If we start punishing businesses for exercising their right to manage their workforce, we set a dangerous precedent." Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Punishing businesses? That's quite a stretch, counsel." Callaway pressed on, clearly hoping to salvage what little ground he had left. "This is about practicality. Employers can't be expected to document every single personnel decision in exhaustive detail." Caroline cut in smoothly. "Except when they specifically agree to do so in a signed contract." A few more heads in the gallery turned. The mood had shifted so completely that even Callaway could feel it now. He wasn't just losing, he was unraveling. Judge Grayson nodded slowly, tapping his fingers against the bench. His silence stretched long enough for Callaway to shift uncomfortably. Then finally he spoke. "Miss Levitt is right." The words landed like a gavel strike. Callaway inhaled sharply, about to object, but the judge held up a hand. "This court cannot ignore the plain language of the contract. The employer voluntarily limited their own discretion. The fact that they failed to meet their own contractual requirements is not a technicality. It's a breach." It was over. Callaway knew it. The judge knew it. And Caroline, standing calm and composed, knew it too. The spectators exchanged glances, murmuring about the way this had unfolded. What had started as a routine case, one where a judge and opposing counsel had dismissed Caroline without a second thought, had turned into a legal masterclass no one had seen coming. And Judge Grayson, once so eager to laugh at her, was now forced to acknowledge her brilliance. Judge Grayson sat in silence for a moment, his fingers still lightly tapping the bench. The weight of his own words lingered in the air. His demeanor had changed entirely, from dismissive to contemplative, from amused to impressed. Callaway, on the other hand, was still searching for an escape route. His lips parted as if to object, but there was nothing left to argue. The contract was clear. The case law was on Caroline's side. The judge had just acknowledged that, but he wasn't ready to concede, not yet. "Your Honor," Callaway finally said, voice forced into a calm that barely masked his frustration, "if we accept this interpretation, we risk creating an unmanageable standard. Employers will be handcuffed by overly strict documentation requirements." Judge Grayson gave him a flat look. "Mr. Callaway, I fail to see how a company being expected to follow its own written contract is unmanageable." A chuckle rippled through the gallery. Callaway's face tightened. Caroline remained perfectly still, watching the exchange unfold. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't react beyond what was necessary. Winning wasn't about celebrating, it was about control, and right now, she had all of it. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple before turning back to Caroline. "Miss Levitt," he said, a hint of reluctant admiration creeping into his tone, "I must say you've put forward one of the most well-prepared defenses I've seen in a case of this nature." Caroline inclined her head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." Grayson gestured toward Callaway. "And unfortunately for the plaintiff, you've left them with no legal footing to stand on." A final blow. Callaway bristled, but there was no coming back from that. He could file motions, request delays, try to maneuver around the inevitable, but the ruling was clear. Judge Grayson sighed and straightened his robe. "Given the failure to meet contractual termination conditions, the court finds in favor of the defense. The plaintiff's claim for wrongful termination is dismissed, and the employer is liable for breach of contract. Damages will reconvene to determine appropriate compensation." The gavel struck. The case was over. The reaction in the gallery was immediate. A mix of murmurs, some stunned expressions, and even a few impressed nods from the more experienced attorneys present. Callaway's shoulders sagged as he gathered his papers, avoiding eye contact with Caroline as he shuffled away. He had underestimated her. They all had. As Caroline collected her files, she felt a presence lingering nearby. She looked up to find Judge Grayson still at the bench, watching her with an unreadable expression. "Miss Levitt," he said after a beat, his voice lower than before, "you'll do well in this profession. Just try not to make too many old judges feel stupid along the way." A few quiet chuckles. Even Caroline allowed herself a small smile. "I'll do my best, Your Honor." She turned, walking out of the courtroom with the same steady confidence she had walked in with. Except now, everyone knew exactly who she was. Caroline stepped out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished marble floors as she exhaled quietly. The tension she had carried for the last hour hadn't quite left her body yet, but the weight of what had just happened was finally sinking in. She had won, not just the case, but something even more significant: respect. As she made her way down the hall, she could hear the murmurs behind her. A few law clerks whispered to one another, sneaking glances in her direction. A junior associate, someone she recognized from a large corporate firm, nodded at her in acknowledgement as he passed. Even if they didn't say it aloud, they saw what had happened in that courtroom. They saw a judge who had laughed at her, an opposing counsel who had dismissed her, and a gallery that had expected her to be outmatched, only for all of them to watch her dismantle an argument with pure legal precision. She reached the courthouse steps and took a breath of crisp afternoon air. Then she heard it. "Miss Levitt." She turned. Richard Callaway stood just a few feet away, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Callaway, ever the seasoned attorney, was good at hiding emotions, but Caroline could see it. The tightness in his jaw, the way his fingers gripped the file in his hand just a little too hard. He wasn't angry. He was embarrassed. "You put on quite the show in there," he finally said. His voice was measured, his tone neutral, but Caroline caught the reluctant respect behind it. She didn't gloat. She didn't smirk. Instead, she simply nodded. "I wasn't performing. I was presenting the law." A flicker of something passed over his face. Annoyance, acceptance, maybe both. "Well," he said, shifting the folder under his arm, "don't expect all judges to take kindly to being called out like that." "I don't expect anything," she replied. "I prepare for everything." Callaway let out a short exhale, something close to a laugh, before nodding once and walking away. Caroline watched him disappear down the steps before turning back toward the street. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text to her client. "Case dismissed. Employer is liable. Will call with details." A moment later, 3 dots appeared on the screen. Then, "You're incredible. Thank you." Caroline pocketed her phone, finally allowing herself a small smile. Because today wasn't just about proving herself. It was about making sure that next time she walked into a courtroom, no one would dare laugh at Caroline Levitt again. The story of Caroline Levitt's courtroom triumph over a dismissive judge and a cocky lawyer offers powerful lessons that extend far beyond the legal realm, resonating deeply in everyday life. One central message is the strength of preparation and knowledge. Caroline's meticulous research and command of facts turned the tide against her skeptics, teaching us that thorough groundwork can overcome even the steepest odds. Another key takeaway is the value of resilience under pressure. Despite initial mockery from Judge Grayson and Callaway's arrogance, she remained composed, showing that staying calm and focused can shift perceptions and outcomes in our favor. The story also highlights the importance of challenging assumptions. Caroline defied the stereotype of an inexperienced attorney, urging us to question biases and prove our worth through action. Finally, it underscores accountability. The employer's failure to honor its own contract led to its downfall, reminding us to uphold our commitments with integrity. In life, these lessons inspire us to prepare diligently, stand firm against doubt, reject unfair judgments, and act responsibly. Caroline's victory is a testament to how determination and principle can transform adversity into triumph, offering a blueprint for navigating personal and professional challenges with grace and strength.